personally, in person. Jim Hightower here, coming to you from the Lowdown Happy Hour, right here at the Hightower Chat and Chew Cafe, that being my kitchen, as you can see in the background. And once again, we're bringing you taking you some places that you might not have been before, you might not have thought of, with some people you may not know, but you should know. And we've got a jewel for you here tonight. We want you to connect with us. Deanna, our Brooklyn cohort, is right there in Brooklyn, awaiting you wherever you are across the country and across the cosmos to connect in. So buzz in, give us your insights, your stories, your humor, and your questions that you might have. And tonight, I think you're going to be loaded with them because we've got a very special for you here tonight at the Chat and Chew, and it is about an old topic, mostly mistold, and that is the world of Indigenous Americans, or Indigenous people around the world, but in particular here, Americans. Their struggle, their movement is not really separate from us, though the media would make you believe that, or the old stories, the old movies, and et cetera, TV shows and et cetera, would make you think, oh, well, that's them, and then there's us. We're watching them. But our issues, our movement, is America's movement, which is theirs. So this tonight is not in any way a retelling of massacres and poisonous blankets, of Custer's Last Stand, and of dream catchers, and etc. But we're going to bring you an Indigenous perspective on the struggle, survival, success in today's America, drawing from our guests 20,000 years of inherited knowledge, experience, and culture that you're not going to get from college. You're not going to get it from Congress, for sure, but we're going to bring it to you from the source. Someone who we should know, who's making a difference in the world, an activist, a strategist, and a storyteller. In my mind, the storytellers are the most important people in our culture, in our society, because they connect us from back there to up here and out there. And that's what we're doing tonight with our guest, Julian Brave NoiseCat. Julian, thanks so much for being with us. Julian,
thank you so much for having me. I don't know if I'm going to be able to live up to that. That was like you were introducing some sort of epic character from a novel or something. I don't know if I'm going to live up to that one, but thank you.
We're going to show that you are, by the way. So, because Julian is, as you can tell, of a younger generation of Native American activists. And I've known, been involved with, folks like Winona LaDuke and Floyd Westerman, LaDonna Harris, and et cetera, over the years in my own politics. So I know something about this world. But now it's a new energy and a new intentional purpose, I think, to bring this tradition, this great culture, to the fore for the benefit not of them, but of all of us. So we're going to try to do that tonight with Julian. And Julian, I understand we find you in your home now in Washington, D.C. What is that cap you have on there? It seems to have what looks like jalapeno peppers to me, but go ahead.
Well, I heard that you were going to wear your gallon hat today, so I had to wear my own hat. This one is from this Indigenous streetwear brand called Section 35. It's named Section 35 because the section of the Canadian Constitution that refers to Aboriginal rights and title in Canada is Section 35 of that Constitution. and it's a red Mox hat, so it's a play on the Red Sox hat, but with with moccasins. Yeah,
very good. And Canadian reference is legitimate here because Julian was raised in Oakland, California, but also in native territories in British Columbia. I'm going to try to say it. I will mess this up, but I owe them the legitimacy of at least attempting it. Sequapemc and Statlium territories in British Columbia. Is that anywhere near correct?
That was close. It's Secwepemc and Statlium territory in British Columbia,
I was real
Canada.
Close to that. Yeah. I was within 1,000 miles of that. But anyway, the important point is your origin story, because it is truly a worthy story in its own right. A lot of people are not aware, but most Native Americans live not on reservations, but in cities. Dallas, for example, has a huge population of Indigenous people, and Oakland has as well. But you grew up, you're raised by a single mom, is that right?
Yeah. I grew up in Oakland, California, raised by a single mother. My father, as you said, is originally from British Columbia, Canada. He's an artist. He moved down to the U.S. Through a little-known provision of this thing called the Jay Treaty, which was a treaty signed between the first governor of New York and First Nations in the United States, which basically allowed for free passage of Native people across the U.S.-Canada border. And so to this day, status Indians in Canada are allowed to move to and work in the United States. And my father is one of the people who moved here on that treaty law, and met my mother in a bar just outside New York City in the 80s. And they ended up in Oakland.
A lot of things happen in bars.
Yeah, they ended up in Oakland, and it was a great city to be raised in for a number of reasons. One of them is that Oakland has the third oldest urban Indian community center in the country. It's called the Intertribal Friendship House, and has a very storied urban Native community that was largely founded by Native people who were relocated there through a federal Indian relocation program in the 50s and 60s.
And is that how you got involved in Indigenous issues or in progressive activism generally?
I would say that Oakland was a big part of it. Yes. I mean, Oakland, of course, had the student movement in the 60s, and the Black Panther Party was founded there. And there was the Chicano movement. The United Farm Workers weren't far away.
Right.
And in 1969, there was, in many senses, sort of the origin of the modern Native rights movement in the occupation of Alcatraz by a group called the Indians of All Tribes, which was a group of Native activists and urban Native people living in the Bay Area, who took over the former federal prison on Alcatraz Island and stayed there for about 19 months. And that history and the memory of that protest, sort of was really central to the community that I grew up in. At the end of drum and dance practice at the Intertribal Friendship House on Thursday nights, they would sing the American Indian Movement song when I was a little kid. So, yeah, I would say that was a big part of it. And then, I think just anyone who's born Native and anyone who grows up in sort of a single mother or single parent household, I think is just born with a sense of injustice and sort of born into a circumstance where the fight for dignity and rights and those sorts of things are, part of who you are, essentially.
Well, in effect, who you are seems to cut across all sorts of issue and important lines, certainly of class and race, as you've indicated, but also cultural lines and the environment. So somehow or other, your beginnings there in Oakland brought you into the environmental movement, and then led you into pipelines. Now, that is something that all of our folks who are tuned in across America know very, very well. Because it's not just the big pipeline up in South Dakota, the big fight that we had a couple of years ago, and is still ongoing, and maybe we're going to make a little progress there. We'll talk about Deb Holland here in a minute, our new Interior Secretary, but also Joe Biden's possible willingness to stand with the people on this against the corporate giant that is running roughshod over tradition and individualism and freedom and people. So we'll get into that. But what got you into the pipeline issue?
Yeah, so I came of age in the 2010s. I went to college and then sort of was a young man in that period. Which was, I would say, a decade that had a lot of Native activism that was focused on what might often be called environmental justice issues. And in particular, the impacts of extractive industries, so mining, pipelines, fossil fuel drilling, et cetera, on Native lands, Native rights to self-government of our territories, and then also on Native people and our environment. And I would say that I was kind of an accidental environmentalist. I'm borrowing that phrase from this, guy, Dr. Robert Bullard, who is sort of the father of the environmental justice movement. And, like I would say other people of color, just the reality of, the disproportionate burdens of pollution and poverty that were just, evident in Native communities, and that there was a lot of, campaigning and activism focused on when I was a young man, led me to the pipeline issue, the campaigns against the Keystone XL pipeline, the Dakota Access pipeline. In Canada, there was this thing when I was in college called the Idle No More movement, which was a movement led by First Nations peoples against this bill that was proposed by then Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, called Bill C-31, which included a lot of provisions that would have made it easier for corporations to cross waterways and potentially pollute First Nations territories and waters. And there was a lot of activism that sort of came out of the grassroots from that, and then spilled over to the United States, and then found its way into various things like the movement against Resolution Copper Mine at Oak Flat in Arizona, the movement against the Keystone XL pipeline, the movement against the Dakota Access pipeline, et cetera. And, I was very much sort of swept into all of that, given my sort of predisposition, growing up in a place like Oakland, hearing stories of the occupation of Alcatraz and all that sort of stuff. And, essentially focusing on the pipeline issue, I started thinking more about the environmental impacts of pipelines, the public health impacts, and then sort of following, the oil, both up the supply chain, sort of thinking about the impacts that has on the climate and the atmosphere, and then also up sort of the supply chains of power, the policymaking processes that, basically mean that Native people have very little to no say on these developments, and ordinary people have very little to no say on these developments, as well as sort of, the structures that make that so. And that led me into, I guess, what many people would describe as sort of the environmental movement or the climate movement.
Well, and the connection of pipelines to the whole environmental movement is clear, but the connection to everybody is clear, because those pipelines, there are thousands of miles of pipelines in your backyard that many people don't know, but most people are becoming aware of it. And there is a tremendous cross-cultural, cross-race pipeline movement of ordinary people in this country trying to battle these bastards who are, again, literally running roughshod over us. And by the way, this is not quite connected, but our friend Diane Wilson, who we've had on our show before. Diane is a fourth generation shrimper down on the Gulf Coast of Texas. who battled for 40 years, the Formosa Plastics Corporation down there, and the pollution that they are pouring with a pipeline out into the bays that has devastated the fishing industry and the fishing community in those areas. But Diane won a tremendous fight last year in federal court after 40 years of battling, so perseverance pays off. We hope that not everybody has to wait 40 years, but after all, I think Julian would say that a lot of us have waited hundreds of years for any element of justice, so perseverance matters. And Diane is now on a hunger strike, and tomorrow will celebrate the 1 month anniversary of her hunger strike. This is no small thing, because hunger strikes are not political gestures. They debilitate your body. Cesar Chavez went on numerous hunger strikes, and it apparently contributed to his premature death. So this is a stand that people are taking against these moneyed interests in our society. And Julian, that is what has impressed me about your effort, and you work with a group called Data. Help me here. Data what? Progress.
Data for Progress. Yeah.
Data for Progress, based now in Washington D.C., but across the country. Tell us how that relates and how it sounds like a wonkish kind of. Here's another thing using data to do stuff that we don't even understand, but. Tell us how it relates to the actual activist movement in our country.
Yeah, absolutely. So, firstly, I think solidarity to Diane, and I'm glad that you brought that up on the show. So, Data for Progress is a think tank that really just started as a blog, founded by, among others, my friend Sean McElwee. A guy who we were talking a bit about, I guess people are drinking and we're talking about bars and stuff. So I met Sean at a bar in the Village in New York City, I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago now. And he hosted these sort of happy hours for, lefties and progressives and such in the city before the pandemic. And we just sort of kept in touch. He was a boisterous guy who had, I thought, interesting views on politics and large following on Twitter. And I think at the time I was trying to figure out how to get this one job that my friend said he might be able to help me get. So that's how we got connected. But over the sort of years after that, we kept in touch. And in the sort of fall of 2018, and even before that, sort of the summer of 2018, there were a number of sort of, upstart progressives who were running for the House of Representatives, and, had in their campaign platforms this thing called the Green New Deal that people were kind of beginning to talk a little bit about in sort of environmental activist circles. And nobody really had defined what that really meant. It was more of a vibe, I guess, than anything else. And so Sean and I reconnected around that time. Data for Progress, which was really just a blog, put together sort of its own proposal or its own paper for a Green New Deal. I was working at another activist organization called 350.org. We started collaborating a bit more on things related to the Green New Deal. And that spring, Sean essentially, we had been working together from our different jobs and organizations for a little while. Sean said that, he was trying to build Data for Progress into an actual organization from being basically just a website. He asked if I wanted to, come on and work on Green New Deal type things with him. And I, being sort of a young person interested in building new things and personally kind of into sort of policy and wonky stuff, jumped at the opportunity and, came on in a 1 month contract with no healthcare. And from there, we've built it now into an organization that employs I think 19 people last time I counted, which is really cool and exciting. And I have a little team that I work with specifically on Green New Deal type climate stuff, which has been really cool to see come
let's
to
mention
fruition.
that because you wrote something called the Indigenous Green New Deal. And by the way, the 350.org is our friend Bill McKibben, and he has been something of a mentor to Julian. And you're bringing that dimension in. Talk a little bit about the importance of that. I mean, after all, who is greener than the indigenous community for, again, thousands of years in our society?
Yeah, so I have this affiliation with this other organization called Indian Collective, and through them I helped draft sort of Indigenous position paper on the Green New Deal. And essentially, sort of stepping back from the specifics of that policy paper, which was probably boring to a evening show audience. The sort of central idea that I have been very interested in, or one of the central ideas I've been very interested in over the last number of years, is this notion that has itself actually come from grassroots activist movements, which is that Indigenous peoples, can be environmental leaders in the 21st century, leaders for a more just relationship between people and the non-human and other than human world. This is sort of central to all of the movements against extractive industries and for a more just relationship and for Indigenous sovereignty. It's also really core to the push to make Representative Deb Holland into Madam Secretary Deb Holland over the last number of months. And, I guess that sort of developing what that might look like in terms of policy, in terms of empowering specific leaders, in terms of building real meaningful relationships of support between progressive organizations and movements and Indigenous nations and movements is just something that I'm personally, for pretty obvious reasons, very invested in. And yeah, so that has been something that I've been working on in addition to sort of the broader, or as part, I guess, of the broader sort of climate and environmental work that I'm very interested in. And the things that sort of Data for Progress specifically, the skill sets Data for Progress specifically brings to that are, we have the ability to do public opinion research, so polling and things like that to help substantiate the campaigns and policies and causes that activists are pushing into the mainstream,
and the public support.
Exactly.
For these movements and for these solutions that are being put forward, that the powers that be would have you believe are radical ideas, and the people don't want it. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Exactly, and I think that that's super important because there is this sort of beltway common sense that says that everything activists and progressives do is an electoral non-starter. It's like radioactive material that only a fool would touch, and often that is not true, actually. And also, doing research on the views of voters and such can also help politicians who share our ideology and movements and organizations that share our views and values to better actually advocate for the things that they want to see and to turn these grassroots demands into sort of winning policies. So I think that translation is super important.
I do too, and I'm impressed with something you wrote with a phrase that you have, which is that your work on environmental issues, Indigenous Green New Deal, environmentalism generally, etc., really comes around to the notion that there is another way to live. And that is a dimension that I think Native peoples have a particular credibility to bring because they have lived a different way. And you're really a merger of that ancient tradition with the modern technology. And so let me ask this. Do you find in your own age group both within the Indigenous community, but also just generally in the progressive community or in the population generally of your age group, that there's a different sort of an inclination, a different awareness, a different intention than maybe there has been in the past, when we've had ideas that if we had some regulation here or there, it would make the big difference.
Yeah, I would say that millennials and certainly Gen Z, and I have a little sister who's about to turn 20 actually in 2 weeks or so, are very interested in a set of ideas that prior generations and our parents in particular sort of set aside for a number of years. I would say that, like, the notion that the public sector can intervene in the economy, can provide essential social services and goods, that the public option can be a great thing in many instances and should be empowered and respected, I think, is a really big thing. And then I think the other sort of piece of that, I mean, there's so much encapsulated in what I just said about the importance of government and things like that. I think the other piece is a real commitment to tackling the enduring legacies and realities of racism and colonialism in our society. I think that young people are firstly part of a very diverse generation. And so a lot of our friends or ourselves, come from those sorts of backgrounds and families where that history is very present in our lives, or present in the lives of people who we know. And also, have sort of come of age in a period where, there's been growing conversation and culture and media related to those things. The Black Lives Matter movement has had an immense impact on the way that people think about race and racial injustice. I mean, you can actually measure that in surveys and stuff. And so I think that those two things, a sort of renewed interest in a sort of, FDR vision of government, a renewed interest in what I would describe as sort of social democracy, as well as sort of, a very intense focus on how to deal with, the injustices of race and colonialism. And we should also add in gender and sexuality and things of that nature, sort of, cultural harms. I think
it's an exciting time, isn't it? I mean, fundamental assumptions are being questioned. The pandemic showed us that the real makers in our society are not Wall Street greedheads, but are common workers and bus drivers and school teachers and et cetera. So those assumptions have now been flipped on their head. But it opens up a lot of doors, and I don't know how this is a whole new topic, and we're going to be addressing that some on our program down the road. But there's a movement called the Rights of Nature movement. That is an extraordinary advance in environmentalism, because it says that nature itself has rights that are enforceable in law. If a corporation has human rights, then why doesn't a tree have human rights, or a forest, or a lake, or a river? And this is a movement that is gaining ground, not just in European nations, and by the way, a good bit in Latin America, but also in our country. I wrote recently about a place in, I forget where it is now, South Carolina, I think. But anyway, there is a tree there that is called the tree that owns itself. Because in 1920-something, a guy who owned this lot and had this tree that he loved and admired and it meant a lot to him in his life, deeded the tree its own plot. And so it had a legal right to live. Nobody could do anything to it. and then there was a storm 100 and something years later that the tree, because of age, blew over. So the people planted another tree called the son of the tree that belongs to itself. So that's a whole new concept of nature, and it turns the law toward the environmental favor. And toward the favor of human tradition and human rights as well. So anyway, that's a digression, but it just points out the exciting time that I think we're in, and being led by people like Julian NoiseCat. Now, where next for you? What do you think we should be focused on most? Now you mentioned Deb Holland, former representative from the state of New Mexico. I happen to know her, a great admirer of her work before she entered national politics. And now here she is, Secretary of the Interior, in charge of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I guess, of acres of public lands and of traditions and of governmental functions that have so much to do with environmentalism. What do you think her first responsibility is, of not just of her, but of any Interior Secretary should be?
Ooh, first responsibility. Well, firstly, I'll just say that Deb Holland's appointment as the Secretary of the Interior was something that I was really proud to support and help work on, both as sort of a reporter and advocate, and then also as, someone who was sort of coordinating with other people to try to make that happen behind the scenes. And, I think that she's a really remarkable leader. We should just talk for a minute about how unusual and incredible she is. She has very humble origins. She was a military brat who went to 13 schools growing up. She led a very real life. Her prior jobs before, going to Congress included stints as a cake decorator and a small salsa business entrepreneur. When she was younger, she struggled with alcoholism and homelessness. And when she ran for Congress, actually in 2018, her and her daughter Soma were both still paying off their student loans. Hers were from going to law school.
Both of them.
And, that is a very unusual story for someone to, take leadership in the executive of the United States government. And, we can recount that whole reality. And then that even leaves aside the fact that she is also, a citizen of the Laguna Pueblo who, spent her childhood visiting family on the reservation, tended traditional gardens, cooked for Pueblo feast days, and in 2016 traveled to the camps erected in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline and cooked green chili stew and tortillas for the water protectors. I mean, this is the woman who was nominated and confirmed as Secretary of the Interior, and now oversees about a fifth of the nation's landmass, vast reserves of natural resources, all of which, we should add, were taken from First Peoples, as well as the nation-to-nation relationship with the 574 federally recognized tribes across the country. So she is,
let me just
incredible
pause 1 second to emphasize that 574 recognized tribes, more trying to be recognized, but there's this myth that they're Sioux and they're Cheyenne and Comanche, and that's it. There's a handful of Native American, mostly out west. The Eastern Indians, Eastern Native Americans, have been completely erased in much of our culture, and there was not a section of America that was not populated with these extraordinary people, with this extraordinary civilization that that we have so much to learn from today. And you're stressing Deb Holland's background is so appropriate. And all elements of that background, not just the native aspect of it, but also her humble and hardship upbringing and life. That is extraordinary in Washington D.C. The U.S. Senate is a club of millionaires. Some of them better than others, but nonetheless, it's not a group of people who are making laws for all of us who know anything about what ordinary people's lives are really about. And by the way, that is how, and Julian indicated that, Deb Holland got to be Interior Secretary, not because the corporate lobbyists went to bat for her, but because ordinary people and groups of across the board stood up and supported her. And an interesting thing that she brings, Julian, is she says that that it's good to be nice to everybody, which is from one of her grandmothers, her aunts. Always be nice to people because they might be nice to you later on, and so she's developed a bipartisan support that is extraordinary. Really, I mean, there was Republican opposition, of course, to her nomination, but there was Republican support as well, and that is pretty rare stuff. So maybe you who are tuned in here through Free Speech TV or through our Facebook Live program today, maybe you've got some comments and insights that you might want to ask Julian a question or two. Deanna, let's connect with our Brooklyn connector here and see what we got. What's happening, Deanna?
Hey, y'all. As usual, a lot of love pouring in from all over the country. I specifically, though, wanted to shout out a couple of our regulars that show up for every happy hour. We have Bob in Southeast Ohio. He also, because I always ask folks what we're drinking for happy hour. He is drinking a Mount Carmel Amber Ale out of Cincinnati.
I want to go there.
We got a bunch of IPAs in the mix. I think people are like trying to connect with you, Hightower, on that IPA front.
Right.
And also shouting out to our coffee drinkers
yes.
for our non-alcoholic beverage drinkers. We support
Some people
you.
drink water.
Imagine that. And so, yeah, a lot of comments that have come through have been asking more questions about Deb Holland and exactly where you guys are at right now. So tell us a little bit about this intersection of class that doesn't necessarily hit a DC arena very often, and tell us a little bit more about what it was like to kind of campaign for her nomination and what that looks like, the inside outside Washington game a little bit. I think people want to hear some about that, if you're willing to talk about it, Julian.
Yeah. So firstly, I would say that the other piece of who Deb is, and you just touched on it a little bit, is Jim, and that is that she's just a very decent person. She is a progressive. She was a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She was a supporter of Medicare for All and the Green New Deal and all that sort of stuff. But she also, I think, did something that I think normal people mostly do, but apparently politicians forget this when they, go to Capitol Hill. And that's just like, be nice to people. I think the thing you said about her aunt telling her to just be nice to people, that was something she told me in an interview for this profile I wrote about her for Politico magazine back in November, when she was being considered for the role of Interior Secretary. And, that just that small thing, those common acts of kindness and decency made her into probably the only politician in America who could legitimately say that she counted among her supporters, congressional Republicans, folks who are not liberal at all, like Don Young of Alaska, who introduced her in her Senate confirmation hearings to the Energy and Natural Resource Committee, as well as, youth leftist groups like the Sunrise Movement and the Justice Democrats. They were endorsing her for Interior Secretary. And how often do you see those two Venn diagrams overlap in American politics, right? Like those two things never meet, but they do meet when it comes to support for Madam Secretary Deb Holland. And I think that that's a really important thing. And I think it comes from the fact that she's just like, a normal person and not like a hoity-toity elite.
One more thing I would just jump in there to say about her that I don't know her as well as you do, but I do know her. Been with her a little bit, and she knows how to laugh. She enjoys life, and she exudes that. She loves a good story. And tells a good story, and you've been. It's something we stress a good bit on our little happy hour routine here, Julian. Is that the culture is always ahead of the politics, and that culture, by which I mean music, by which I mean stories, by which I mean movie making or video making or whatever, but artists are a greater force in our society than sometimes progressives want to give attention to. Sometimes we want to set people down and just berate them with facts, more facts than they can possibly absorb, much less comprehend. and it's so much richer to have people who know how to convey a thought in a way that it can be absorbed. And you've been part of something called the powwow circuit. Now, powwow is sort of became a pejorative for a long time there because it was a caricature of Native Americans. It was used as that by white filmmakers and storytellers and others. But in fact, the powwow circuit is a very powerful influence in indigenous culture and increasingly can be in our larger culture. Talk about your role in that.
Yeah, so the powwow circuit is a often competitive intertribal dance and singing circuit, basically, actually, where people every weekend from about April all the way through to October, and then also sometimes in the fall and winter, Native people get in their cars and drive for hours and sometimes thousands of miles to go to these celebrations that are hosted across Indian country in North America, in the US and Canada, to dance in a number of categories that are representative of dances that are in some instances traditional from various tribes. So you have things like the jingle dress dance, for example, that comes from the Ojibwe people. It's a woman's dance that actually originated during the Spanish flu in 1919. It actually came to a medicine person among the Ojibwe people as a response to that last pandemic. And you also have newer sort of dance categories that were invented, from older traditions in like the 60s and 70s as like, for example, the women's fancy shawl dance, which was like basically women wanting to do the sort of fancy dance that men had started doing on the powwow circuit. And it's this vibrant sort of subculture that, tribes and people across the US and Canada participate in. It has gotten very little attention, aside from in, some offhanded references and like, Sherman Alexie has a book called The Business of Fancy Dancing, and there's some like cult classic movies like Powwow Highway that sort of have images of powwows in them. But it's like a big thing for Native people. And it was a big thing for me for a long time when I was growing up. I actually started dancing at the Intertribal Friendship House. They have, as I was saying, drum and dance practice every Thursday night. They're actually still doing it virtually during the pandemic. And, I started doing that when I was a young man, actually a boy. And, my family put together, through their own hard work and labor, regalia for me to wear, that included beadwork and feather work and all that sort of stuff. And up through college, I would travel all over North America competing at various celebrations throughout the summer. And I was decent enough that I would win sometimes or usually, and, be able to pay for my gas and whatnot. And my big claim to fame is that I actually won a horse once competing at a powwow.
And you got to feed
it. Yeah, I actually gave it to my uncle, my late uncle, to take care of, because he was the horseman in the family.
Well,
so yeah, it's this wonderful thing that not that many people know about. And to your point, yeah, there are all these sort of problematic old stereotypes about Native people dancing and holding powwows, but it's actually a real thing, and a really beautiful, really beautiful thing. And there's actually a bunch of drum groups actually on the powwow circuit that have won like Grammys and stuff, and been nominated for multiple Grammys and things like that. So it's this whole thing that exists, and just unknown, unfortunately.
Yeah. There's one here in Austin, Texas, a pretty big one, pretty big event here in Austin that brings people from all around. Well, we want to keep dancing with you, Julian Brave NoiseCat, and the great work that you are doing. And we'll put the connections up on the screen here, but tell us just as directly as you can how folks can stay in touch with you.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. My handle is @JNoiseCat. I also have a website where I sort of post my most recent writings and such. I've considered making a newsletter, but I don't have one yet. My website is just my full name, julianbravenoisecat.com. And you can also follow the work of Data for Progress. It's @DataProgress on Twitter. And the website is dataforprogress.org.
Julian Brave NoiseCat, thank you so much for being with us, and thanks for the great work that you're doing. It's so important, the cross-cultural references, but also so much that we have a larger community to learn from the Indigenous people that have thousands of years of knowledge and experience and wisdom that we can use. Thank you, Julian. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.